Well, good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to start the first plenary session, the Human Rights to Science. My name is Samira Kiani. I'm an associate professor of genetic engineering at University of Pittsburgh in the US, and also I direct a Science and Society initiative called Tomorrow Life at University of Pittsburgh. It's my honor to moderate this panel of high caliber members today. And before going into this hopefully very interesting session, I would like to take a couple of minutes to introduce the panelists. And this is going to be hopefully an informal, quite interactive session. We will have, after introduction, we will have a poll. We are asking you a question that you will be answering by using your phone, and we will have a conversation, show some videos, and then take questions from the audience. So I'm going to start with introduction. Just a quick question. Michelle is joining virtually. Is she there?
Yes, I am joined virtually.
She's there. Well, great. Well, moving forward, this is a session about the human right to science. As GESDA, as we all know, we would like to predict how science and technology is shaping our future. And because the emphasis is science and technology, the first question we should ask is that what is the human right to science and how do we define that and what type of actions we need to take moving forward. So today we will have 4 panel members, starting with Michelle. Michelle Bachelet is currently from 2018, assumed her functions as the United Nations High Commissioners for Human Rights. Ms. Bachelet was elected President of Chile on 2 occasions from 2006 to 2010 and 2014 to 2018. She was the first female president of Chile. She served as health minister from 2000 to 2002, as well as Chile's and Latin America's first female defense minister. In 2010, she chaired the Social Protection Floor Advisory Group, a joint international labor organization and World Health Organization initiative. In 2011, she was named the first director of UN Women, an organization dedicated to fighting for the rights of women and girls internationally. She has a medical degree in surgery with a specialization in pediatrics and public health. And she has also studied a military strategy as Chile's National Academy of Strategy. Next, we have Peter Maurer, who is a Swiss native and studied history and international law in Switzerland. In 1987, he entered the Swiss diplomatic service, and since then has held numerous diplomatic positions. In 2004, Mr. Maurer was appointed ambassador and permanent representative of Switzerland to the United Nations in New York. And in 2009, the UN General Assembly elected Mr. Maurer chairman of the 5th committee in charge of administrative and budgetary affairs. In 2010, he was appointed Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs in Bern, and later in 2012, he succeeded Jacob Kellenberger as International Committee for Red Cross president. Next, we have Camilla Markram. She's a neuroscientist, autism researcher, and co-founder and CEO of Frontiers, a leading open access academic publisher and social network for researchers. She is on a mission to make research freely available for the benefit of humanity, popularize science, and the people behind the discoveries to help create aspirational role models for the younger generation. Camilla obtained a master's degree in psychology from the Technical University Berlin in 2003 and completed her master's thesis at Max Planck Institute for Brain Research. She has a PhD in neuroscience at EPFL in 2006. She frequently speaks at universities and conferences on topics related to autism, open science, and future of scholarly publication. And last but not least, we have Yvonne Donders, who is a professor of international human rights and cultural diversity and executive director of Amsterdam Center for International Law at the Faculty of Law at University of Amsterdam. She has graduated from Utrecht University in International Relations and has done her PhD at the Law Faculty of Maastricht University on cultural human rights and right to cultural identity. Her research interests include public international law, international human rights law, in particular economic, social, and cultural rights, and human rights and cultural diversity. She's currently a member of numerous prestigious organizations, including a National Commission for UNESCO, a member of the Human Rights Committee of the Advisory Council on International Affairs. Well, thank you very much for joining me in this panel today. We are going to start the session by asking everyone in this room and also everyone who is listening to us today virtually to start asking a question about the human rights to science. We're asking what exactly you think the human right to science is. Is it the right? And then you have like about 6 answers that you can choose from. Mm-hmm. So great. Seems like most of us believe that the human right to science is the right for everyone to be included in the benefits of science. A number of people believe that it means for everyone to access scientific productions freely. And 2% believe that it means of scientists to receive compensation for their work. That's good. Well, I hope that this session will at least help us clarify some of the answers that we have and figure out if there is any way that we can push, some strategies forward to actually include that in our practices. So I'm going to take the next 20 minutes and answer some questions directly from the panel member, and then we can just like make it more interactive later on. I would like to start my question from Michelle. Michelle, I have a question for you. I would like to know your opinion about what does human right to science exactly mean? And more precisely, I want to say that science is not merely knowledge, it's a social institution. Science is also partial, incomplete, and reflective of the priorities of those who guide and shape it. Does the right to science include the democratic right to shape, question, or otherwise hold to account the kind of science that is done in and for the societies in which it's embedded? And how does the right to science interact with other ideas of human rights?
Well, thank you, Samira. First of all, let me tell you that I'm delighted to be part of this important discussion. And every day I feel in awe with scientific and technological progress. And not that long ago, I remember waiting for the morning newspaper to receive some news of the day before. Now everything is reported in real time and through ever-evolving communication methods and channels. Today, we share information easily, and we even have robots to assist in many spheres of life. With cameras, we can visit anyone, anywhere in the world. And many of us are forever grateful for that, because my family is in Chile. So being in Geneva, for me, this is a great opportunity, not only during lockdowns, but every day. So as a medical doctor, I have seen so many advances in medical science, enough to amaze me and for the rest of my life, as they should everyone, but it is within our right. So what is human rights to science exactly? Well, you already have shown the Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states the right of everyone to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. But this is also reinforced by Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which as of July 2020 had 170 state parties voluntarily assuming this article as a legal obligation. So the human right, as you correctly said, the human rights to science is more than access to knowledge. It is also a tool for the realization of other human rights and fundamental freedoms, such as food, water, housing, education, health. But sadly, it's still far from being a reality for everyone. Nowhere is this more visible now than in the case of vaccine injustice, which restricts people's right to life and health, to development, and to the benefits of scientific progress. The pace at which we gain scientific knowledge has been extraordinary, and I think countless lives have been saved. By August 2021, almost 5 billion vaccine doses had been administered, but the vaccine gap between rich and poor is a stark example of the severity of inequalities we should never grow accustomed to. More than 80% of the doses administered globally had gone to high and upper middle income countries, even though they account for less than half of the world's population. So the lack of access to vaccine and medicines puts millions of lives in developing countries in immediate danger. It also poses a threat to people everywhere, as mutating forms of the virus may emerge among largely unvaccinated populations. So the pandemic also has demonstrated that access to digital technology and the internet plays an essential role in disseminating public health information, ensuring incomes during lockdowns, and enabling that children can continue their education. But once again, a huge part of the population has been left behind. As in every right, the right to science must be accessible by all and benefit for everyone's participation without discrimination. In addition, it mandates that scientific innovation benefit people rather than harm them. But here too, there's often a gap between what should happen and what actually happens. For example, while artificial intelligence can help improve productivity, monitor epidemics, or support economic growth, it can also have built-in discriminatory effects. Openness and transparency in the development of AI algorithms can help prevent people from being discriminated against based on characteristics such as their race, their age, their sex, or disability. It is also important to see that science is developed while respecting human rights. The improvement of public policy and governance through science policy interface can be undermined if scientists are harassed for speaking out about their findings or being denied fundamental freedoms to carry out their work. So the right to science is not widely known, and all of us can help change that, because respecting human rights is essential to creating the world we all want to live in. But let me say very briefly, you asked me, the second question is how we think on if science should have, in some way, should be directed or not. Having been a minister of health, I realized that we had lots of grants for scientists, that they were developing lots of very interesting methodologies and very interesting research, but none of that was useful for the kind of question we had as responsible for health. So we maintain a line where researchers could research in any area they were interested in, but we also put money on a line where the questions that the country needed to be answered in terms of the health situations could be also considered. And I think that and also we put a lot of more money also in basic science, so we could have all the kinds of sciences developing that we needed in terms of, in this case but also on social science as well. So I think you need to maintain the capacity of investigators to have the freedom to investigate in whatever they need, but also if a country needs to have concrete scientific answers to solve certain problems, that can also be addressed.
I think my follow-up question to you is that what happens when the scientists would say, I have the right to explore knowledge, right? So that's the scientist's right to science. And then the knowledge that they are exploring, like let's say we had a conversation about human primate chimera, is something that society doesn't want to go, not necessarily quite in benefit of the society. But then the society can say, my human right to science is for it to benefit. So when these two are opposing each other, how would we approach that, to your opinion?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Well, I think you need to find ways, as we did it, that you can support both ways, because sometimes a researcher could be interested in something that he thinks it will be very important for humanity, even though other people could not see that importance. So you could support those research, but at the same time, you find ways of supporting research that are needed to solve society's problems, and that also people feels that are really important. But on the other hand, I believe that unfortunately many societies, there's not much scientific information on the right to science, and you need also to, I would say, to inform much more societies, communities of the value of science. And we have seen this is particularly important when we're discussing about vaccination and all those people who don't want to be vaccinated, or worst of all, leaders of the world who do not follow science, evidence, science, facts to decide in terms of internal policies. So I think we need to do a lot in terms of promoting much more the importance of science, which is why it's so important that decisions are made evidence-based, scientific evidence-based. So, and also to, I would say, have a better narrative and communicate better to the people, so they can also learn how important those advances are and why they should take those instructions and those decisions into consideration and act accordingly to.
Well, thank you. I want to move on and ask, because we talked about, you mentioned the access to science. I'm going to start with Camila, and I'm going to ask you, well, there are lessons that we have learned from the COVID pandemic. How do you define that as a CEO of this journal that promotes open access? What kind of lessons we learned from the pandemic? And as we know, that the idea of open access to science is a necessary step towards safeguarding human right to science. But how do you think that we can ensure that the information that is shared is used for the benefit of the humanity as well?
Okay. Thank you, Samir. So let's start with the scientific misuse, maybe, and then we're going to talk about the benefits of making science open versus the harm that is actually done by restricting access to science. The scientific misuse actually has got absolutely nothing to do how you publish the science, whether it's done in a restricted way, limited to just a small audience, or whether it's done in an open access way to a more global audience. Those who have a bad intention or criminal mind, whether it's to engineer a virus or a bomb, and have actually the means to do these things, they will find the science to get it done. Misuse really is tackled through a scientific discourse that goes into a broader societal discourse, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. This is translated, I believe, into ethical guidelines, into very rigorous scientific standards, eventually into laws, regulations that are binding to every single person, whether it's a scientist or a member of the public. And that's how you, and these standards are going to be enforced. They're enforceable, and offenders are punished. And that's how you tackle really misuse. When you restrict access to science, the only thing that actually happens is that we slow down our global innovation cycle. Science today is really underpinning every single aspect of our life. Globally, we spend $2 trillion every single year that we pump into our research labs, both in the private sector and at universities. This accumulates in a lot of research that is then published. And traditionally, it's been published in hard copy journals. Every single year, we're publishing now 3 million research articles in scientific journals. They used to be hard copies, so with very limited distribution, reach and access. But about 20 years ago, these hard copies were put onto the internet. And potentially now could reach a much wider global audience. That was the idea, and that's the reason why the internet was actually created by scientists. But that actually is not what has happened, because legacy publishers may have adapted to this new technology, but they kept the old business model in place. So universities and companies today pay about $10 billion every single year in subscription fees to access this content, the research. As you can imagine, there is not one single university in the world, whether it's the EPFL or Harvard, that can actually afford to pay access to all the research journals. And so the consequence is that researchers don't have full access, even within their own research fields, to the latest science. You can imagine that your grandmother who's got cancer cannot access the latest science on cancer. Even the doctor who's treating her does not have access or full access, maybe a little bit more, but not full access to the latest treatments. An innovator at a startup who's trying to find a cure, limited access. A journalist who's writing about cancer has almost no visibility on the latest science, depends on secondhand information. And even policymakers who decide about budgets don't have access to the science. Entire regions, countries, and continents are disadvantaged. Just within the European Union, Eastern Europeans have less access to publicly funded science than Western. South Americans, less access than North Americans or the Chinese. And you can imagine Africa, we just spoke about vaccine equality. Africans are pretty much excluded in benefiting from publicly funded science. So all that this does really is slowing us down and excluding certain groups of people from the benefits to science. On the other hand, what happens when you open up this vast knowledge of science? And beautiful things happen. And let's get to COVID now, because that is an amazing illustration of the beauty of open science. Last year, when the pandemic hit us, something happened that none of us had achieved in 20 years of trying. It basically opened up the scientific literature overnight almost. So this is the story. In January 2020, when COVID was still a remote thing in Wuhan, Chinese scientists already shared openly the genetic sequence of the coronavirus. And this immediately triggered a race for vaccines at BioNTech, at Moderna, but all across the research labs across the world. 2 months later, in March 2020, when Corona now became more of a global phenomenon, people were dying, our economies were shutting down, the US White House did the following. They created the CORT-19 database, and they started collecting, inserting all coronavirus-related research articles into this database. And the US White House mandated that all of this research needed to be open access, even that published in subscription journals, because it just became crystal clear to everybody that that is what needs to be done in this emergency situation. At the time, there were about 30,000 corona articles. Today, it's 400,000 articles. And all of them are openly available to both humans, but as well to machines, because it's quite obvious nobody can read this anymore. Not a single person that you see on TV telling you about Corona has read those 400,000 articles. We need machines to help us with that. Now, only because all of this science was made open, were scientists able to collaborate now far more effectively, and they delivered. They delivered solutions, those treatments and vaccines at a speed that we've never seen before in human history.
Yeah.
So this was absolutely the right, just 1 minute.
Sure.
It was the absolutely right policy decision to do that. But I think that policymakers need to actually learn from this experience, because it's not the only emergency we're in. Climate change is determining everything right now. And again, most of this science is behind paywalls. So if we want to get those solutions, and science does have the solutions to the climate emergency, but if we want to get them out fast enough, on a time scale that matters to protect biodiversity, allow our kids to have a safe future, the science needs to be made open.
That is a very important observation exactly about COVID and the lessons learned from that. And that actually is a good, opening to a question from Yvonne. As a legal scholar, I want to ask you, that what kind of progress has been made so far to ensure the access and this right to science is addressed, and what initiatives do you see have been taken today?
Thank you. Well, first of all, this initiative is for me quite unique. 10 years ago, nobody would have a session on the human right to science in these kind of summits. We've tried really hard, but it was really hard to come to these kind of conferences. So I should congratulate you already with this initiative. Now, what is fascinating, we started with the Universal Declaration on the screen. That is 1948. At that time, it was considered important to connect human rights and science. And the idea behind that was, well, if not everybody could equally perhaps participate in science, but at least everybody should be able to benefit from it, and states should share in their scientific advancement. Now, that's a very noble human rights idea, obviously, in 1948. It was continued in other legal instruments. But the fact is that, well, nothing really happened with it. The fact that it was included in this document was important, but let's face it also, the world of science was very simple then. There was a handful of very intellectual men, mostly men, sorry, it was not so many women at the time, taking part in scientific advancement. And most of that scientific knowledge was in the hands of states as a public good. So in that time, it was easy to have this noble idea of sharing science for the benefit of humanity. But nowadays, of course, the world looks very, very different. Now, what I find important in these international legal instruments is that it is included thereby in a document that provides the foundation for policies, for practices, all of these things. However, and that's a bit unfortunate to tell to law students normally, law doesn't solve everything. That's a disappointment to them sometimes, but it is true. And especially international law like this is sometimes not more than a piece of paper. It has to be implemented by states. Now, once again, states have not paid a lot of attention to this right. Academics have not paid a lot of attention. That has changed over the last years. More academic research is done on this right, but still mostly from, say, my people, the human rights lawyers, a couple of political scientists perhaps, but not, I would say, the scientists, the hardcore scientists, like probably most of you are. They have not been engaging yet, and I think we should, in developing this idea of the right to science. As you posed the question at the very beginning, what does it actually mean? But I would also say, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to you? And indeed, it was nice to see that most of the participants did not answer, indeed, it means this for me in terms of being remunerated and having, doing my own science freely. But most of you answered, well, my science or our science should benefit humanity. So there's a lot of legal developments also going on in courts nowadays. And that's perhaps also interesting to mention, because when it is in a legal document, there's monitoring. So at international level, as the High Commissioner was mentioning, the committees and UN bodies are now engaging indeed in further clarifying this right. And why do we do that? Well, we do that because states have to implement it, and it has to be part of our discussions in science. A final word on challenges. One of the major challenges, in my view, is this privatization of science and knowledge, because the international legal instruments are not equipped for that. They address states. They address how states should implement this. And now that there is more and more scientific advancement, knowledge, technology, no longer in the hands of states or initiated by states, you get into these discussions on the commercialization of science and knowledge, whereby choices may be made not so much for what humanity needs, but what, you know, a couple of companies would need. And it ties very much into also what Camilla is saying. We see that also in the open access field still.
This is actually amazing, because you will see a video at some point that I want to get your reaction from, based on the point that you just mentioned. But, you know, the last questions of this section, I'm going to, you know, direct it to Peter. I want to ask you about whether you can describe a formative event in your early career when it first hit you that some people benefit from scientific advances while other people don't as much, or are even harmed by efforts of scientific progress. Where were you, and why did that experience make an impact on you?
I think, as many in that room, important events, and maybe it's more of a process than a specific event, take place when you are socialized for the first time in science. It's between 18 and 25 years of age, where you come to university and you study, in my case, history and social sciences, and you study the impact of science on social developments and the history of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, and the disruptive force of science. You are included in debates on the impact of Einstein's letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt on nuclear science and the atomic bomb. And you ask yourself, where is the interrelationship between society, where you are, and science, where you are socialized and doing your degrees. And then I moved from university to diplomatic service, and I was trained in, unsurprisingly, as a Swiss diplomat, in the advantages of protecting science and all the interest policy of the state to have a diplomatic service engaged to protection of scientific results through patents. And of course, with a critical mind, you see that this may be not the best of the solutions for the problems which we are encountering. And over the sort of decades of my professional career as a diplomat, you find that you are confronted with an increasing amount of problems we are piling up in our political multilateral space, and for which access to science is not guaranteed in a sufficient way. Mm-hmm. And when you see the relationship between multilateral policy and science, you become aware how important it is to have evidence-based policy making. And there, I think that's basically not an event, but the red thread, which has informed my whole diplomatic life, which was by and large in a multilateral arena confronted with problems and challenges were beyond any country's capacity to solve, and where, on the other hand, you needed to bring scientific evidence to problem solving. And I think that's where we stand today, whether it is climate change, where we have a fantastic track record of bringing scientists to evidence and creating the basis for political solutions, whether we talk about COVID, and you have brilliantly made the story about it, whether we talk about conflict today, and we look into the evidence and drivers of conflict resolutions, which allow us to sort of tap into the potential of science in order to find approaches to solutions to some of the intrinsic problems with which we are dealing. And I think the confrontation with the humanitarian challenges and issues today at the ICRC made me such a strong advocate of evidence-based policymaking, which is another word to be an advocate for the human rights of science and for having societies take advantage of scientific research in order to solve problems.
So I hear you that you're saying that evidence-based policymaking is one of the ways we can actually start working to prevent harm and kind of like address all these issues. Is there any specific example you have in mind to show us how it can play out?
Well, look, if I take it from today, what is on my desk, what is interesting, for instance, is to look at autonomous weapon systems. How do we mobilize science in order to frame solutions for autonomous weapon system, which will fundamentally change the way warfare is and might be done in the future? And so how do we frame research, and how do we tap into research, and what are the normatives and ethical bases which we can apply to the development of weapon systems in order to frame them and contain them? If I look at misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, which is such a potent driver of conflicts in today's world, the question is, how can we work with the scientific community in order to put and to frame our responses into the disruptive force of technology, the use of technology, the use of social media, in order to frame and to prevent the sort of disruptive power of science into conflictual reality with which we are dealing. These are just two examples which are at the present moment on the desk, but of course, all is about leveraging the positive impact of scientific research to manage conflictual realities in which we are, and to minimize and frame the negative and disruptive forces science can have at the present moment on those conflicts, and working on both sides, on the leveraging the positive and framing the negative is what informs by and large what we are doing at the ICRC and what I try to do also in participating in GESDA.
Great, thank you. So I think now we can add some action to the conversation. So maybe we start by showing 3 short videos, and then I would like to, after each video, get some reaction from the panel, and after the videos are over, then open the floor to some questions and interaction. So shall we start the first video?
Josiah, you have been known for doing some pretty radical things with this technology. I actually saw you inject a plasmid, which, if it worked, would have allowed your muscle to continue growing.
Yeah.
Why do you do what you do?
I'm a big advocate of self-experimentation and trying to get around the system, because the question isn't anymore, how are they going to regulate us? It's how are they going to stop us?
But other people in the scientific community, I think they're kind of calling in the regulators and the governments to, put the screws on this.
How do you stop it though, right? We've been doing gene therapy on humans since the late 90s. We know it works. We know you can modify humans. This isn't something that like people should question anymore. It works. That's what I want people to do. Modify yourself.
Modify yourself. So this Josiah Zayner is a biohacker in the US. He's very famous, lots of social media followers. He's, the question he's asking is, who will stop us? And I'm just going to start with you, Yvonne, in terms of, we're talking about democratization, we're talking about privatization. How do you feel about that?
Well, let me first start. When we take science and human rights, it means that we have a normative framework to do these things with. It's about human dignity. That is as the basis of human rights. And just following up also briefly on what Peter was saying, I mean, no, hardly any human right is unlimited, because not only I have human rights, but you do too. So we have to balance always the different human rights of different people involved. So who's going to stop us? Well, the law partially is going to stop you if indeed science is causing harm, because it's about balancing interests, and it's also about possibly limiting scientific freedom or even the dissemination of certain knowledge, if that harms broader society, for instance, or if it harms certain disadvantaged groups. Human rights is also very much about the protection of certain groups that need that. And I'm thinking, for instance, about children, I'm thinking of people with disabilities, I'm thinking about other minorities. So framing it as a human rights actually provides you freedom, provides you access, but also may protect others against, say, misuse, abuse of this right. So in that sense, human rights framework provides both if it's done correctly, obviously. The problem with the privatization is that many of these private institutions, they are not bound to the international legal norms. And that is what now is also being developed, new instruments on business and human rights. How should businesses be held accountable for human rights violations? But that is a field that is still very much under development. And I think it would be good if we don't wait for the lawyers, don't wait for us. As Camila was also saying, there are already ethical codes being developed as well. You can also do it bottom up. You don't have to wait for legal instruments or legal laws to be implemented. You can start also yourself with having this discussion.
Josiah would argue with you that it's my body and I can do anything with it. It's about self-experimentation. How would you respond to that? Because you're talking about harm to other people, but this is about, okay, this is my right to my body and I want to use science. So in your opinion, and then there are people who are watching him and the people who are following him and they do the same to their bodies. Should we allow that kind of, open access and to move forward just because,
Well, let's face it, people do a lot to their bodies, good things and bad things. And indeed, you have, in that sense, also a large form of self-determination. Also, in terms of medical treatment, you may refuse certain medical treatment, which may actually be very beneficial to you, or vice versa. You may indeed harm yourself by, I don't know, having drinking, smoking, having piercings, whatever, or indeed, as he is suggesting, injecting stuff into yourself. There is a large form of self-determination as long as it only concerns you. But the question is, are you properly, for instance, informed about the consequences of what is happening when you're doing this? Are you properly knowing what is going on? And that is very often, especially with young people, of course, still a major challenge. Are people sufficiently educated? But also in terms of scientific information, it's difficult if you're not an expert. Do people realize, and of course, people in the medical world know all about this, that you have to keep on informing people, okay, if you want to do this, these and these are possible consequences, this is the choices that you have, etc. That conversation is not easy, but has to be done before actually people can enjoy that freedom properly.
Yes. And one of you have.
Yeah, maybe
yeah.
if I can
Sure.
just add to this informed discussion, because of course science always pushes the boundaries, and it's up to us to decide what's good or bad. Do we want to allow this or not? And it's within the scientific and societal discourse with the lawmakers that this decision will be taken. But in order to have this informed discussion, a factual discussion, one that is not hijacked by fear mongering or misinformation, as we see so often, I think two things need to be there. And one of them is absolutely fundamental. And that's the first one. So having the access to the science. If I do not know what gene editing is or what CRISPR-Cas9, and I think this is what this guy is talking about as well, in modifying himself. If we do not know what this is, it's or we can't access the information and we rely on secondhand information about somebody else telling us about this, it's difficult within even the scientific community to have this discussion.
Mhm.
I think if it goes beyond the scientific community to society, lawmakers, other people, the second step really that is absolutely fundamental is that we understand the science. And here I think scientists have an obligation. What is CRISPR-Cas9? What is gene editing? They need to explain this in easy terms. I think science publishers, as we are one, we have an opportunity and we can help in here as well in translating these concepts. We have, for example, the Journal for Children that explains what is CRISPR-Cas9, what is gene editing in very, very simple terms, and they are even involved in the peer review process. So understanding in terms of concepts is very important to have this discussion. But the other thing in terms of understanding is making sense out of an ever-growing amount of research that is out there. 3 million articles, 400,000 about corona, gene editing exploding. And there's not one scientist, not a person, not a lawmaker that can actually read this on their own anymore. The solution and the answer to this is not to say, like, oh, let's publish less. And a lot of people are proposing that. In society, we're pumping more and more money into researchers, more and more researchers coming out. So obviously they publish more. What we need is proper tools, how to make sense out of all of this research. And here I'm talking really about artificial intelligence, machine learning, technology that can help assist us. In COVID, this is what's been happening. Putting this stuff out there, all of these 400,000 articles actually allows scientists then to mine it, use these types of tools, and then come up with the right solutions for it.
I wanted to briefly come in because I was intrigued by the who will stop us question, and also by what Yvonne started to say, and it resonates, of course, with the core of my work at the present moment. We talk to a lot of belligerents who will challenge us on who will stop us to violate laws and principles, and what do you do in order to strengthen the normative framework in the mainstream. And the honest answer is nobody will stop those who want to transgress normative systems. The question is what we do. And here I just wanted to highlight the importance also of building consensus in communities. What is licit, illicit, legal, illegal, doable, not doable, ethical, non-ethical. And I very much support what Yvonne was alluding to, that don't wait for any authoritative normative systems telling you what the norm of the society is. Because the norms in societies, in science, in other areas of societies are growing through consensus of communities, professional communities, living communities. And I think it is important to value this consensus building around the new frontiers of science as we value them in creating other normative systems in societies. And I think I just wanted to briefly also refer to some of the cutting edge science we have done over the last couple of years on what steers behavior, and integrating behavioral science into our way of how we look into normative systems in the future is absolutely essential. And we have transformed our way of engaging in belligerence and ensuring respect for norms and principles because of behavioral science, because we know what pressure points, what influences are, and how we can mobilize communities to express themselves and to set limits as they find them legitimate. And I think it is important to value these bottom-up, community-based, multi-stakeholder approaches to develop norms and principles. So nobody will stop the abuser. And we have to get somehow rid of our obsession that law and principles are only valuable if they stop the abusers. Laws and principles are valuable because they express what societies are about, and not because there are abusers transpassing laws and principles.
That's a very good point. And I want to just ask Michelle's take on this as well. Michelle, if
Yes, well, first of all, I was thinking he was not speaking about science. Maybe you cannot stop science. Maybe you can research on many different issues, even though I do believe, and particularly when we're talking about new technologies and artificial intelligence, that the human rights approach should be at the beginning, before, because what we see today is that there's a lot of application, there's a lot of technologies, and then a company start thinking, will it harm somebody? Could it have a problem? It should be from the beginning, before something is developed, should be considered, which could be the harm or the possible effect or consequence. But he was more talking about the use of science in itself. That brings me more like my experience of medical doctors. And I think in medicine before, doctors would say anything, patients would have any right to decide against or in favor of certain treatments. And I think we have advanced a lot in terms of ethics there in hospitals, or even with research. There's a lot of ethics committee that go through before the research starts or before there is a clinical trial with that. Of course, patients should have, in many countries you have, that they have to give consent to any treatment or any use of or testing HIV, etc. And the other thing is, yes, people have freedom to decide individually, but on the other hand, the question is that person in the real capacity to make the best decision? People can maybe want to kill themselves, and maybe some people will believe they have the freedom to kill themselves. But the question that I make myself, is that person in the emotional better state to make the best decisions? Is he not only well informed in terms of the consequences, many of my colleague panelists have already mentioned, but is that person in the best capacity to make the best decision for him in the present and in the future? So I think we need to, I mean, I agree with all of what had been said, but the only thing that I want to add on what Yvonne was saying at the beginning is that yes, laws, treaties do not necessarily ensure the result. But one of the interesting things of human rights is the access to information, that people can participate and can also make states responsible for what they already signed or approved. So even though that's not ensured that a state will do the right thing on access to science, on any other issue, it helps people to push and demand from governments and from states and from to do the right thing. On business, and I do agree as well with Yvonne and with Camila and Peter, but I do believe, that's why I do believe we need to move forward in terms of, and that's why at the UN we have been calling for that the UN should be the convening power to put together companies, states, academia, scientists, technology experts, civil society, to also define and a smart mix of measure what can be done. Because what's happening today is that many of these things are looked at every company itself, and as Peter was saying, ethics can change, norms and values can change, and it can change from one company to another and from one country to another. So I think science and technology is advancing much faster than what we have been able as an international community to really define what are we going to do with it before it can be harmful for everyone. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. I was hoping that we could shoot the 2 other videos, but I'm excited that the conversation was productive enough that we don't need that stimulation. I'm just going to open the floor to any questions that you might have and want to ask the panel members. Yes, there's a question there.
Hi, my name is Fred Fenter, and I'm Chief Executive Editor of Frontiers. I have just it seems to me that in this whole question of the right to the access to benefits of science, Mr. Morel, you talked about evidence-based policy, and I think this is an instrument probably which is key in terms of being able to take those results and bringing the benefits to populations. And I think we've kind of gone around the theme and looked at the responsibilities of the different people in this process. And so I'm just wondering, to what extent are scientists responsible for participating in this process of evidence-based policy, the development of evidence-based policy?
Great.
Well, that's a tough question, but we can't do it without scientists. We can't somehow, yesterday in the opening plenary, I thought it was very interesting, the sort of deep valleys between science and political societal practice and application. And I think without interest, responsibility, and engagement from the scientists to go through the valleys or to build the bridges over the valleys, we won't be able to do it. We can't just, as sort of frontline operators on the societal challenges today, basically tap ourselves into the society. We are dependent on the kind of responsibility of scientists wishing to contribute and to be able to have that dialogue and to bring those loose ends together. Without this, we will basically hang in the open and not be able really to have solidly anchored evidence-based policy making. So the responsibility engagement towards political and societal challenges seems to me absolutely essential. And we all know that this is a delicate balance, because we don't want to constrain science by political ramifications. So we need delicate maneuvering on how to frame that relationship. But I would very much affirm that we need that space for dialogue and engagement, and it needs responsibility and responsible behaviors from both sides.
Samir, can I go in here a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
Samir?
Yeah.
Michelle wants to say something.
Yeah, well, I think COVID-19 will give us some hope, because on COVID-19, the scientific community was pretty much together. They wanted really to find solutions. They wanted to find vaccines. They wanted to not only to find but also to share information, knowledge, so everyone would benefit of that. And I think that is a big hope. But I think the biggest problem could be, as many of my panelists have also mentioned before, is the system. Because if you depend on a lab who is paid by a company or by a determined state, I don't know how much freedom those scientists have to really being able to have sort of a responsible, the responsibility that we're talking about. I do believe that scientists do want to make science for good, if I may say, but I think the privatization of the science, of the research, can produce, give limits to the scientist.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Michelle. I think we are right on time to finish the session. There are, of course, more questions, and maybe we can just continue the conversation during the break. Thank you very much. And to the panel members, it was a great conversation. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Samira.